Hey guys, tonight we're talking about something that is genuinely beloved by millions of Americans who cannot finish a sentence, a to-do list, or occasionally a thought: ADHD medication. Not the conspiracy theory version, not the back in my day we just called it being a bad kid version. The actual drugs, the stimulants, the non-stimulants, the ones your co-worker won't stop talking about, and the ones your doctor handed you like a golden ticket while you were still mid-sentence explaining why you forgot your last 3 appointments. So before you get comfortable, I genuinely want to thank whoever suggested this one, because it might be the most requested topic this channel has ever gotten, and honestly, fair. You know who you are, and this is for you. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing the 3 AM crowd assemble, and if you want to drift off to this channel on Spotify, the link is in the description. Now, dim those lights, put on a fan, pull the blanket up, let your phone go dim in your hand, and let's settle in. Because here's what I want you to think about before we start. Have you ever sat down to do one thing and somehow ended up reorganizing your bookshelf, starting a podcast, ordering a lamp, and Googling whether platypuses have knees, all in the same 40 minutes? Have you ever read the same paragraph 6 times and retained nothing except a vague feeling of personal failure? Have you ever been prescribed a medication and genuinely wondered, what is this actually doing to my brain? Is this safe? Will I feel like a robot? Will I finally be able to do my taxes? Why does Adderall exist, but also why does Ritalin exist if Adderall exists? What even is Vyvanse? Is it just expensive Adderall? Why does everyone on the internet sound like they're either cured or ruined by these things? And why does your friend who takes Concerta seem totally fine while your other friend had what they described as a pharmaceutical awakening on the exact same dose? Congratulations, you have just woken up inside the history of ADHD pharmacology. The year is 1937. A chemist has accidentally discovered that giving children amphetamine makes them calm and focused instead of chaotic, which is deeply confusing to everyone involved. And the next 80-odd years of neuroscience, ethics, marketing, and breakfast skipping are about to unspool in your living room. Welcome. You're going to learn a lot tonight. Most of it will make you feel something. Let's start at the beginning, which in this case means starting inside your skull. Before we can talk about any drug, we need to talk about the thing the drugs are trying to fix, or at least nudge in a more cooperative direction. ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, is not a modern invention, a parenting excuse, or a personality flaw that got a Latin name. It is a neurodevelopmental condition that affects the way certain brains regulate attention, impulse control, and executive function, which is the technical term for the part of you that is supposed to make you do things like start tasks, manage time, and not accidentally spend 40 minutes watching a video about vintage cash registers when you are supposed to be writing an email. What makes ADHD unusual, and what took science an embarrassingly long time to understand, is that it is not a deficit of attention so much as an inconsistency of it. You can pay attention. You just can't always choose what you pay attention to, and the thing demanding your focus is frequently not the thing that matters. Here is what the textbooks say about ADHD in plain language. The prefrontal cortex, the region sitting right behind your forehead, the part of the brain responsible for planning, prioritizing, initiating tasks and regulating impulse, is not doing what it's supposed to do at full efficiency. It is not broken. It is not damaged. It is running on a different set of parameters than the people around you, and those parameters create a brain that has genuine difficulty with what neuropsychologists call executive function. That phrase covers a remarkable amount of territory. Starting a task that is boring but important, shifting attention from one thing to another when circumstances change, remembering what you were doing 5 minutes ago, keeping a sequence of steps in your head long enough to execute them, regulating the emotional response to frustration. All of these are executive functions, All of them are harder, on average, in an ADHD brain. Not impossible. Just harder in a way that is invisible from the outside, which is part of why the condition spent most of its history being misread as laziness. There are 3 presentations of ADHD, and understanding them matters because they look completely different from each other. The predominantly inattentive type is the one where you drift. You sit in the meeting. You are physically present. You are technically listening. And yet somewhere between the 3rd and 7th slide, your brain has quietly left the building and is now thinking about whether penguins have knees, or replaying an argument you had in 2013, or constructing an elaborate plan to reorganize your living room that you will never execute. Nobody has noticed you are gone because you look perfectly fine sitting there. The predominantly hyperactive impulsive type is the one that gets noticed. You cannot sit still. You interrupt. You make decisions without finishing the thought. You feel like there is a motor running somewhere inside you that nobody else seems to have, and it cannot be turned off, and it is exhausting, and you are aware that everyone finds you a lot, and that awareness does not actually make the motor stop. And then there is the combined type, which is both of those at once, which should give you a sense of what a full day feels like when you have it. What ADHD is not, and this is worth saying clearly because the culture has been confused about it for decades, is a childhood condition that you grow out of. Approximately 60 to 70% of children diagnosed with ADHD continue to meet criteria for the diagnosis as adults. The hyperactivity often becomes less visible with age, replaced by internal restlessness, a buzzing, jittery quality that other people cannot see but that you feel constantly, like a phone on vibrate that never stops. The inattention does not go anywhere. The executive function difficulties do not self-correct because you turned 18 and are now technically responsible for your own life. They just become more expensive. You miss the rent due date instead of the homework due date. The stakes have gone up while the underlying neurology has stayed the same. This is not a moral failing. It is not a character deficiency. It is a brain doing what brains do, which is exactly what it was wired to do in a world that was not designed for it. Here is where it gets chemical. The reason ADHD brains behave the way they do comes down, in large part, to dopamine, the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation, reward, and the satisfying feeling that doing a thing is worth doing. In a neurotypical brain, dopamine is released in steady enough amounts that routine tasks feel achievable, and the promise of a future reward is motivating enough to get started now. In an ADHD brain, the dopamine system is dysregulated. It is not that there is no dopamine, it is that the brain either does not produce enough of it, does not receive it efficiently, or clears it from the synapse too quickly. The result is a brain that is chronically understimulated at baseline, and that will aggressively seek stimulation wherever it can find it. Novelty, urgency, drama, danger. A very interesting Wikipedia rabbit hole at 11:30 on a Tuesday night when you have work in the morning. Understanding dopamine is not just a chemistry lesson. It is the key to understanding why almost every ADHD medication in existence works the way it does. Let's back up slightly, because the word dopamine has been so thoroughly colonized by wellness culture and app developers that it has largely lost its meaning, and you deserve the real version. Dopamine is a catecholamine neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger synthesized in certain neurons and released across the gap between neurons, called the synapse, where it binds to receptors on the receiving cell and produces a signal. It is involved in movement, motivation, learning, pleasure, and what researchers call reinforcement, the process by which the brain decides whether to repeat a behavior. The dopamine system does not actually produce pleasure in any simple, direct way. What it does is produce the anticipation of pleasure, the forward-leaning feeling of wanting something, of being pulled toward a reward, of believing that a particular action is worth taking. When dopamine fires in response to a cue, it is the brain saying this matters. Pay attention, keep doing this. In an ADHD brain, This system does not fire with the same reliability in response to ordinary tasks. Making a phone call, filing a document, answering an email, starting an essay that is not due until Thursday. These things carry little immediate novelty and produce little immediate reward, and so the dopamine signal that would normally motivate a person to begin them simply does not appear with enough strength to get the job done. The task sits there. You know it needs doing. You intend to do it. You're aware that you should already be doing it, and yet some invisible gap exists between intention and action that no amount of willpower seems to be able to bridge. This is not procrastination in the ordinary sense. Procrastination implies a choice. This is more like standing at the edge of a pool, knowing you need to jump in, wanting to jump in, deciding to jump in, and still just standing there, while your body waits for a neurochemical signal that is slightly too quiet to actually trigger the dive. The other side of this is hyperfocus. This is the part that confuses people from the outside, and honestly confuses the person experiencing it too. If ADHD is a problem with attention, why can someone with ADHD spend 6 uninterrupted hours assembling a model train, or reading about the geology of Iceland, or editing a video that nobody asked them to make? The answer is that the dopamine system in an ADHD brain does respond. It responds powerfully to things it finds inherently interesting, urgently novel, or emotionally meaningful. In those situations, the attentional gates throw themselves open and everything else falls away. Hyperfocus is not a superpower. It is the same dysregulation that makes boring tasks impossible, just running in the opposite direction. You're not more productive during hyperfocus. You're differently unregulated. The thing you're hyperfocused on may be delightful or useless, and the ADHD brain does not particularly care which one it is. It is chasing the dopamine, and right now the dopamine is in the model train, and the mortgage paperwork is just going to have to wait. Norepinephrine matters here too. It is dopamine's less famous sibling in the ADHD pharmacology story. Norepinephrine acts in the prefrontal cortex to sharpen the signal-to-noise ratio. It helps the brain filter out irrelevant information and pay attention to what is relevant in the current moment. Dysregulation of norepinephrine in ADHD contributes to distractibility, to the way every ambient sound in a room can feel equally loud, to the inability to maintain focus in environments that are not perfectly quiet and controlled. Most ADHD medications work on both dopamine and norepinephrine together, which is partly why they help not just with motivation, but with the sensory overwhelm that so many people with ADHD experience and rarely think to mention when describing their symptoms. The room gets quieter when the medication is working, not literally, but neurologically. The background stops competing quite so aggressively with the foreground, and for a while, you can actually hear what you're trying to think. The story of ADHD medication begins not with a controlled clinical trial or a brilliant pharmaceutical breakthrough, but with a pediatrician named Charles Bradley, who was trying to solve a completely different problem. In 1937, Bradley was working with children who had behavioural difficulties at a residential school in Rhode Island. He had been giving them Benzedrine, an amphetamine inhaler, as a treatment for the headaches they developed after spinal taps. He expected nothing in particular. What happened instead startled everyone in the building. The children became calmer, more focused, more organised. They performed better in school. They were easier to be around. Nobody had predicted this. Nobody had a framework for understanding it. Bradley wrote it up carefully and published his findings, and the medical establishment largely ignored him for the next 2 decades. This is how pharmacology often works. A door gets opened by accident. Nobody walks through it for a generation, and then suddenly everybody is walking through it at the same time, wondering why it took so long. The year's 1937, and you're a child at the Emma Pendleton Bradley home in Providence, Rhode Island. You're there because someone, a teacher, a parent, a confused doctor, decided you were different enough from other children to need a residential program. You do not sleep well. You cannot sit still. You're impulsive in ways that get you in trouble before you have a moment to think about whether you want to be in trouble. You've just had a pneumoencephalography, a procedure in which air is injected into the fluid surrounding the brain so that the brain structure can be visualized on an X-ray. It is as unpleasant as it sounds. The procedure routinely causes crushing, persistent headaches that last for days, and Dr. Bradley has been looking for something to relieve them. The Benzedrine inhaler was his idea. It stimulates the central nervous system, and he hypothesized it might increase the production of spinal fluid to relieve the headache pressure. What actually happened was this. You took the inhaler, your headache improved, or did not improve, and then you sat down at your schoolwork and found, to your own surprise, that you could do it, that it made sense, that the noise in your head had quieted, that you wanted to finish. Dr. Bradley noticed. He ran an informal study. 14 of 30 children showed remarkable improvement in school performance and behavior. He called it a spectacular change. He was right. It just took the world 20 years to agree with him. The delay matters, and it is worth understanding why it happened. 1930s medicine did not have the conceptual vocabulary for what Bradley was observing. There was no ADHD. There was not even a well-defined category of childhood behavioral disorder that could receive a drug treatment. Psychiatry was largely psychoanalytic in orientation. The assumption was that behavioral problems in children stemmed from family dynamics, unconscious conflicts, and developmental trauma, not from neurochemistry. The idea that a stimulant drug could calm a distractible child was paradoxical to the prevailing frameworks, and paradoxes in medicine tend to get filed away rather than pursued. Bradley published his paper in the American Journal of Psychiatry, received polite acknowledgement from a handful of colleagues, and then watched the field move on without him. He continued treating children with Benzedrine at his facility and reporting excellent results, but the research establishment did not follow. He would have to wait. What finally broke the logjam in the 1950s and 60s was not a sudden change in scientific opinion, but a change in social circumstance. American schools were growing rapidly, classrooms were getting larger, and teachers were increasingly overwhelmed by children who disrupted instruction, could not follow directions, and seemed to exist in a state of perpetual exhausting motion. The medical profession, responding to pressure from educational institutions and from families who were genuinely at their wits' end, began looking more seriously at pharmaceutical solutions. Bradley's work was rediscovered, his observations were replicated, and slowly, haltingly, the field began to accept what a Rhode Island pediatrician had put in writing in 1937, that a stimulant drug could do something remarkable for a certain kind of brain. The accidental discovery became intentional treatment, and the ADHD medication era, though it did not yet have that name, had begun. Before Adderall, before Ritalin, before Vyvanse had a marketing budget, there was Benzedrine, a drug so culturally ubiquitous in mid-20th century America that it appeared in Jack Kerouac novels, Second World War soldier kits, and the medicine cabinets of housewives who were told it was a diet aid. Benzedrine was, at its core, a racemic amphetamine, a mixture of two mirror-image forms of the same molecule. It was introduced in the 1930s as an over-the-counter inhaler for nasal congestion, which is about as medicinal as it sounds. Physicians quickly noticed it also produced energy, euphoria, and a strong desire to organize your kitchen drawers at 2 a.m. It was prescribed for everything: depression, obesity, low blood pressure, narcolepsy, and eventually Hantour, following Bradley's observations, behavioral problems in children. It was not subtle, it was not targeted. It was a blunt chemical instrument applied to an enormous range of human problems, and for a while, In a country that loved productivity and optimism in equal measure, it worked just fine. Until it didn't. Amphetamine was first synthesized in 1887 by a Romanian chemist named Lazar Edeleanu, who was not particularly interested in its effects on human attention. He was just exploring the chemistry of phenethylamines, as chemists do, and amphetamine was one of the things that came out of it. It sat in the laboratory archives for decades. In the 1920s, American pharmacologist Gordon Alice was looking for a synthetic substitute for ephedrine, a naturally occurring compound used to treat asthma, and he resynthesized amphetamine, tested it on himself, and noted that it produced a strong sense of well-being, increased blood pressure, and decreased appetite. Smith, Klein and French licensed it, put it in an inhaler they called Benzedrine, and began selling it over the counter in 1933 for nasal congestion. The inhaler contained enough amphetamine to produce a significant psychoactive effect when the contents were cracked open and extracted, a fact that users discovered approximately 30 minutes after the product went on sale, which was faster than the manufacturer might have hoped. By the late 1930s, Benzedrine had developed a cultural presence that outgrew its medical purpose by quite a distance. College students discovered it could extend study sessions. Truck drivers found it useful for staying awake on long hauls. Jazz musicians and Beat Generation writers embraced it enthusiastically, and you can trace its fingerprints across the prose of Kerouac and Ginsberg if you know what the inside of a Benzedrine high looks like. The run-on sentences, the relentless forward movement, the sense that everything is connected and urgently meaningful at 3 a.m. The military distributed it to soldiers and airmen during the Second World War, and when those soldiers came home, they carried back with them a familiarity with stimulant use that quietly entered civilian life. You are not looking at a fringe drug here. You are looking at a substance that was woven into the texture of mid-century America so thoroughly that many people did not think of it as a drug at all. It was just what you took when you needed to get through something. The reckoning came gradually. Reports of dependence and withdrawal accumulated in the medical literature. The inhaler formulation was restricted, then reformulated to reduce extractability. Oral tablets became the primary delivery method, and with that came closer medical supervision and a more honest accounting of what the drug was actually doing to people who used it long term. By the 1960s, amphetamine had been classified as a controlled substance in the United States, and Benzedrine itself had largely been replaced by more refined descendants. But its legacy is everywhere in modern ADHD pharmacology. Every amphetamine-based ADHD medication, Adderall, Dexedrine, Vyvanse, is a chemical descendant of the same molecule that was cracked out of a nasal inhaler by college students in the 1930s. The drug got more sophisticated, the molecule stayed the same, and the questions that Benzedrine first raised about who benefits from stimulants, at what cost, and where the line is between treatment and enhancement are still being debated by the same country that once sold the stuff at the pharmacy without a prescription. Benzedrine contained 2 forms of amphetamine, and scientists eventually figured out that only one of them was doing most of the useful work. That form was dextroamphetamine, the right-handed mirror image of the molecule, named for the Latin word for right. And when it was isolated and sold on its own, it became Dexedrine. Dexedrine was stronger, more efficient, and produced a cleaner stimulant effect than its mixed predecessor. It was adopted by the military during the Second World War, handed to pilots and soldiers to combat fatigue and sustain alertness on long missions. The British used it extensively during the North Africa campaign. American bomber crews carried it. It was not considered a drug problem, it was considered a logistics solution. After the war, Dexedrine found its way back into civilian medicine and eventually into the growing conversation about children who couldn't sit still in classrooms. It was prescribed widely through the 1950s and 60s, and it remains available today, still used for ADHD and narcolepsy, quietly doing its work in the background of a pharmacological landscape it helped create. To understand why dextroamphetamine matters as a distinct entity from racemic amphetamine, you need a quick tour of molecular chirality. Chirality is the property by which a molecule can exist in two mirror image forms that are chemically identical in composition, but structurally non-superimposable, like your left and right hands. Chemists call them enantiomers, and they label them D for dextro, meaning right rotating, and L for levo, meaning left rotating based on the direction they rotate polarized light. In the case of amphetamine, the D form and the L form are pharmacologically quite different, despite being made of the same atoms. Dextroamphetamine is approximately 3 to 4 times more potent in the central nervous system than levoamphetamine. It crosses the blood-brain barrier more efficiently. It produces a stronger dopamine and norepinephrine response for the same amount of drug, and it does so with somewhat less peripheral cardiovascular activity than the L form, which means, in rough terms, that you get more of the focus effect relative to the heart rate increase. When you separate the two enantiomers and use only the D form, you get a more efficient, more targeted drug. This is not a trivial refinement. It is the difference between a blunt tool and a sharp one. Dexedrine came to the military not through the slow machinery of clinical research, but through the urgencies of wartime logistics. The Royal Air Force was among the first to distribute it systematically beginning in 1940. Pilots flying long missions over the English Channel needed to stay awake, alert, and capable of rapid decision-making for hours at a stretch. Dexedrine tablets were issued as rations. They were considered roughly as unremarkable as food. The German Luftwaffe, for what it is worth, was using a different stimulant called Pervitin, methamphetamine, with similar intent and considerably more alarming results. The American military followed with their own amphetamine programs, and by the end of the war an enormous number of service members had first-hand experience with the effects of stimulant drugs on performance under stress. This is not an endorsement. It is a historical fact that shaped the post-war landscape of stimulant use in ways that are still playing out today. After the war, Dexedrine settled into civilian medical use and eventually into pediatric psychiatry as the understanding of childhood behavioral disorders developed. By the late 1960s, it was among the more commonly prescribed treatments for what was then called minimal brain dysfunction, the awkward precursor to what would become ADHD. Patients and clinicians both reported that it worked. It improved attention, it reduced hyperactivity, it made school more manageable. It also, for some children, produced anxiety, suppressed appetite significantly, and slowed growth, which became a source of real concern as the long-term data accumulated. Dexedrine today occupies a smaller but still meaningful corner of the ADHD medication market. It is less commonly prescribed than its amphetamine salt descendants, but is still the drug of choice for some patients, particularly those who respond better to the pure D form than to the mixed salt formulations, and those for whom the longer history of the molecule offers a kind of pharmacological reassurance that newer formulations simply do not have yet. While American doctors were working through the amphetamine family, a Swiss chemist named Leandro Panizon was synthesizing a new stimulant compound in 1944 at the Ciba Pharmaceutical Company. He named it methylphenidate. Then, in the tradition of pharmaceutical history that is either charming or unsettling depending on your comfort level, he tested it on his wife Marguerite, who liked how it made her feel before playing tennis. He named it after her. Rita became Ritalin. It was approved in the United States in 1955, initially for a grab bag of conditions including depression, fatigue, and something called narcolepsy, which was at least a reasonable fit. By the 1960s, it was being prescribed to children with what was then called minimal brain dysfunction, which was the era's best attempt at naming what we now call ADHD. Ritalin worked differently from amphetamines in subtle but meaningful ways, and its effect profile-y, clean, shorter-acting, relatively smooth, made it the go-to medication for the next several decades in a way that shaped an entire generation's understanding of what ADHD treatment looked like. Leandra Panizon was working in the stimulant chemistry department at Ciba, a Swiss pharmaceutical company that would eventually become part of Novartis. In the 1940s, the search for central nervous system stimulants was active and relatively unconstrained. The regulatory environment was lighter, the pharmacological toolkit was smaller, and there was genuine scientific enthusiasm for compounds that could treat fatigue, depression, and behavioral disorders in both adults and children. Methylphenidate was one of dozens of compounds Panizon synthesized during this period, and it stood out for its moderate potency and relatively benign cardiovascular profile compared to the amphetamines. His wife Marguerite, Rita, from whom the brand name derives, was apparently in the habit of testing new compounds alongside her husband, and her positive report of its effects before athletic activity helped move it up the priority list. Whether this is a charming detail from a more freewheeling era of pharmaceutical science, or a story that would make a modern ethics board involuntarily wince is a matter of perspective. Probably both. What made Ritalin pharmacologically distinct from the amphetamines was its mechanism of action, though the difference is subtler than most people realize. Both methylphenidate and amphetamine increase dopamine and norepinephrine in the synapse, but they do so in different ways. Amphetamine both blocks the reuptake transporter and actively reverses it, pushing stored dopamine out of the neuron into the synapse, a more aggressive flooding mechanism. Methylphenidate is a reuptake blocker only. It sits in the transporter and prevents the synapse from clearing dopamine and norepinephrine, but it does not cause the neurons to release additional stores. The practical result is that methylphenidate's effects tend to feel somewhat smoother and shorter than amphetamines. A narrower peak, a quicker return to baseline, less of the sharp edges that some patients experience with amphetamine-based medications. Many patients find this profile easier to manage, others find it less effective for the same reason. The difference between amphetamine and methylphenidate response is genuinely individual, and no clinical test tells you in advance which one is going to work better for a particular brain. Ritalin spent its first decade in medicine as a general-purpose stimulant for adults, prescribed for fatigue, for mild depression, for the vague condition then called chronic fatigue and nervousness, and eventually for narcolepsy. Its transition to pediatric ADHD treatment came gradually through the 1960s as the diagnosis, then called minimal brain dysfunction, and before that, hyperkinetic impulse disorder, became more formally codified, and the clinical community began systematically testing medications against behavioral rating scales. Ritalin won. Study after study showed it reduced hyperactivity, improved sustained attention, and made children easier to teach. By the 1970s, it had become the primary pharmacological treatment for the condition, a status it would hold more or less unchallenged for the next 20 years. The controversy it attracted was less about whether it worked, and more about whether a stimulant drug should be given to children at all. A debate that has never really ended, has simply changed volume depending on the decade and the cultural climate. Methylphenidate, the molecule at the heart of Ritalin and its many descendants, works by blocking the reabsorption of dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain. The technical term for this is reuptake inhibition. Normally, After a neuron releases dopamine into the synapse, proteins called transporters scoop it back up for recycling. Methylphenidate sits in the way. It blocks those transporters. The dopamine stays in the synapse longer, the signal is stronger, and the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for focus, planning, and impulse control, gets more of the chemical it was chronically under-receiving. In an ADHD brain, this can feel like something finally clicking into place. Tasks feel possible. Distractions feel less magnetic. The internal noise quiets. It does not turn you into a different person. It does not manufacture focus from nowhere. What it does, when it works, is give a brain that was already trying very hard a slightly better shot at doing what it was trying to do. That distinction matters more than most people realize when they are deciding whether or not to take it. Let's walk through what actually happens at the cellular level, because the mechanism is genuinely interesting, and because understanding it changes how you think about the drug. When you swallow a methylphenidate tablet, it dissolves in your digestive system, enters your bloodstream, and crosses the blood-brain barrier, the protective filtering system that keeps most substances in the blood from reaching the brain. Once inside the brain, it accumulates preferentially in regions with high concentrations of dopamine transporters, particularly the striatum and the prefrontal cortex. The dopamine transporter is a protein that sits in the membrane of dopamine-releasing neurons. Its job is to retrieve dopamine from the synapse after it has been released and recycle it back into the neuron for future use. It is a highly efficient piece of molecular machinery. Under normal conditions, dopamine is cleared from the synapse within milliseconds. Methylphenidate binds to the transporter and parks there. The transporter cannot do its job. The dopamine lingers. The signal persists. The receiving neuron continues to register dopamine presence long after it normally would, and the net effect is an amplification of the dopamine signal in circuits that were previously running below optimal. The same process happens simultaneously for norepinephrine, using the norepinephrine transporter, which methylphenidate also blocks. Norepinephrine in the prefrontal cortex acts as a kind of tuning mechanism. It sharpens the contrast between relevant and irrelevant signals. More norepinephrine means the prefrontal cortex is better at filtering out distractions and maintaining a stable working memory representation of the current task. This is why people on methylphenidate often describe the experience not just as increased motivation, but as a reduction in noise, the sense that the environment has become slightly less chaotic, that their own thoughts are more accessible and organized, that the pull of unrelated stimuli has weakened. What methylphenidate does not do is equally important. It does not increase intelligence. It does not manufacture executive function skills that were never learned. It does not permanently alter brain chemistry. When the drug wears off, and it will wear off, typically within 4 to 6 hours for immediate release formulations, the dopamine transporter goes back to doing its job at its usual efficiency. You're back to baseline. This is why, for many people with ADHD, late afternoon and evening on a medication-treated day can feel like watching the tide go out. The focus recedes, the noise comes back, the half-finished tasks accumulate on the table, while the brain's willingness to engage with them quietly packs up and leaves. This is not a failure of the medication. It is the medication doing exactly what it was designed to do, and the challenge of ADHD treatment is partly the challenge of figuring out how to manage the hours it is not covering. Something interesting happened in America between roughly 1980 and 2000. Ritalin prescriptions increased by approximately 900%. That number is not a typo. The causes were multiple and tangled together in the way that social phenomena always are. Better diagnostic criteria, more awareness among teachers and parents, changes to insurance reimbursement, a pharmaceutical industry that discovered there was enormous money and attention, and a genuine improvement in the recognition of a real condition that had been quietly disabling people for decades. Critics pointed at overdiagnosis. Defenders pointed at underdiagnosis in previous generations. Both were probably partially right. What is inarguable is that by the mid-90s, Ritalin had become a cultural flashpoint. It appeared in magazine cover stories about whether we were medicating childhood itself. Talk shows debated it. Parents fought about it at school board meetings. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, there were millions of actual children who were actually struggling, some of whom the medication genuinely helped, and some of whom it did not, and very few of whom were being listened to about their own experience of it. The explosion in prescriptions had multiple independent causes that compounded each other. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association published the third edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM-3, which for the first time provided operationalized diagnostic criteria for what it was now calling attention deficit disorder, with or without hyperactivity. Before DSM-3, diagnosis was largely impressionistic. Clinicians relied on clinical judgment, behavioral observations, and their own personal thresholds for what constituted a problem worth treating. DSM-3 gave everyone a shared checklist. The number of children who met criteria went up dramatically, not because there were suddenly more of them, but because there was now a systematic way to identify them. This was, by and large, a good thing. The children who had been called difficult, lazy, and oppositional for decades now had a diagnostic category that suggested their difficulties had a neurological basis. Something could potentially be done. At roughly the same time, CHAD, Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Disorder, was founded in 1987 as a national advocacy organisation. CHAD lobbied for increased awareness, better educational accommodations, and broader access to diagnosis and treatment. It produced materials for parents and teachers, held conferences, and gradually moved ADHD from a clinical specialty into public awareness. The organisation did enormous good in legitimizing the diagnosis and reducing the stigma around it. It also, according to later reporting, received substantial funding from Ciba-Geigy, the manufacturer of Ritalin during this period, a detail that does not invalidate the advocacy, but does add a layer of complexity to the clean narrative of pure awareness raising. The media response was characteristically contradictory. The same publications that ran headlines about ADHD being underdiagnosed in girls ran different headlines 6 months later about boys being overmedicated. The moral panic and the legitimacy crisis existed simultaneously, fed by the fact that nobody could agree on a population base rate for the disorder. Estimates ranged from 3% to as high as 15% of children. Depending on the diagnostic criteria used, the population studied, and the threshold chosen for clinical significance. The honest answer, that ADHD is dimensionally distributed across the population, that any cutoff is somewhat arbitrary, and that the goal of diagnosis is to identify people whose functioning is meaningfully impaired, was too nuanced for a cable news segment, and so the nuance was lost and the shouting continued. The children kept getting diagnosed, the prescriptions kept being written, and the real reckoning about what was actually being observed and in whom and with what benefits and costs was deferred for another decade. In 1996, a company called Shire Pharmaceuticals introduced Adderall, and the ADHD medication landscape shifted in ways that are still rippling through today. Adderall was not a new molecule. It was a reformulation of a diet drug called Obitrol that had been on and off the market since the 1960s. Obitrol contained a mixture of amphetamine salts, and when Shire reformulated it for ADHD and gave it a new name, they were essentially repackaging existing chemistry with new branding, a new indication, and aggressive marketing. What made Adderall different from Ritalin was its composition. It combined 4 different amphetamine salts in a ratio designed to produce a smoother, longer onset and a longer duration of action. Where Ritalin could feel sharp and short, peaking fast and dropping off, Adderall felt to many patients like a steadier curve. It lasted longer. It required fewer doses per day. It became, within a decade, the most prescribed ADHD medication in the United States. And it brought stimulant ADHD medication into a new kind of cultural conversation, one that included college campuses, productivity culture, and the beginning of a very long argument about enhancement versus treatment. The 4 salts in Adderall deserve a brief introduction. The formulation contains amphetamine aspartate monohydrate, amphetamine sulfate, dextroamphetamine saccharate, and dextroamphetamine sulfate in a ratio of 3 parts dextroamphetamine to 1 part levoamphetamine. This is important because the different salts dissolve and absorb at slightly different rates, creating a staggered entry into the bloodstream rather than a single sharp peak. The presence of levoamphetamine alongside the more potent dextroamphetamine adds some peripheral sympathetic activity, a bit more cardiovascular effect, that some patients experience as jitteriness and others do not notice at all. The relative contribution of each salt to the therapeutic effect is a matter of ongoing scientific discussion, but the practical clinical picture is clear. Most patients who switched from Ritalin to Adderall in the late 90s reported a longer, smoother duration of effect, which is exactly what Shire promised in its marketing, and exactly what the sales figures confirmed. The Ritalin to Adderall transition in American ADHD treatment was also in part a story about marketing. Shire spent aggressively to introduce Adderall to psychiatrists and pediatricians. Sales representatives visited offices, samples were distributed, the clinical data was presented at conferences, and because Adderall genuinely was, for many patients, a meaningful improvement over immediate-release Ritalin, fewer doses, smoother coverage, better evening function. The marketing found a receptive audience in physicians who had been managing the challenges of Ritalin's short duration for years. Within 5 years of its introduction, Adderall had captured a significant share of the ADHD prescription market. Within 10 years, it was the dominant brand, and it carried a cultural visibility that Ritalin, despite its 20 years of market presence, had never achieved. Perhaps because Ritalin had been associated primarily with children and controversy, while Adderall entered at a moment when adult ADHD was beginning to be recognized and when the conversation about medication was expanding beyond the pediatrician's office into the general cultural awareness. The name itself was not accidental. Adderall, a portmanteau that gestures toward attention deficit disorder, plus all these S, was market-tested and carefully chosen. It is a branding decision masquerading as a chemical name, and it worked spectacularly. When people talk about ADHD medication in popular culture, they reach for Adderall the way they reach for Kleenex or Band-Aid, as a brand name that has become the vernacular for an entire category. This is not pharmacologically meaningful. It is enormously commercially meaningful, and it shaped the public perception of ADHD treatment in ways that subtly privileged amphetamine-based solutions over methylphenidate-based ones in the popular imagination, even though both drug classes have similar efficacy profiles in the clinical literature, and the difference between them is genuinely individual. College campuses discovered Adderall in the early 2000s, and what followed was the kind of social phenomenon that makes pharmacologists uncomfortable and university health centers very busy. Students who had never been diagnosed with anything began taking it before exams. Entire dormitory floors developed informal distribution networks. The pitch was simple and seductive. It makes you focus. It makes you stay awake. It makes the reading feel possible at midnight before the final. What the pitch left out was more complicated. Adderall does not make you smarter. It makes it easier to sustain effortful attention, which can help significantly if you have ADHD, and which can also help non-ADHD people grind through unpleasant tasks, but which does not actually improve higher cognitive functions like creativity or complex reasoning. Studies of non-ADHD users consistently found modest, if any, cognitive benefits, but the perceived benefits were enormous, and perception, when it comes to drugs and performance, tends to matter more than the pharmacology. By 2005, surveys suggested roughly a quarter of college students had used a stimulant non-medically at least once. The study drug had become a fixture of American academic culture, and the ethical conversation about what that meant had barely started. The non-medical use of prescription stimulants on college campuses did not appear from nowhere. It grew out of a specific confluence of pressures: an increasingly competitive academic environment, grade inflation that meant the difference between a good grade and a great grade could have lasting professional consequences, a cultural narrative about productivity and optimization that made enhancement feel not like cheating but like rational self-management, and the simple fact that a lot of students knew someone with a prescription who was willing to share. The DEA classifies amphetamines as Schedule II controlled substances, high abuse potential, accepted medical use, which means they are legally available by prescription and legally unavailable without one. The gap between those two statuses was bridged, on most large university campuses, by informal social networks in which students with ADHD prescriptions became unwitting pharmacists to their entire floor. The pharmacological reality of non-medical stimulant use is more complicated than the dorm room folklore suggested. For students without ADHD, whose dopamine systems are functioning at typical baseline levels, amphetamine produces a genuine but different effect than it produces in ADHD brains. It raises alertness. It reduces the need for sleep. It makes it easier to sustain attention to tedious material. But the cognitive improvements are more modest than users typically believed. Multiple controlled studies in neurotypical subjects found that while stimulants improve speed and motivation, they did not consistently improve learning, memory consolidation, or performance on complex cognitive tasks that required genuine understanding rather than persistence. The student who pulled an all-nighter on Adderall and felt like they had mastered organic chemistry may have felt that way, but performance on the exam was not reliably better than if they had slept. The confidence was sometimes outrunning the competence, and in the dark of the dorm room at 3 a.m, those two things are very difficult to tell apart. The ethical questions were, and remain, genuinely difficult. Is taking a medication that helps you focus different from drinking coffee, which also helps you focus? If it is different, why? Because of the mechanism, the potency, the prescription status, or the source? If a student with ADHD is allowed to take Adderall to level a playing field that was tilted against them, what does it mean when a student without ADHD takes it to tilt the playing field in their favour? Does the drug confer an unfair advantage, or is it simply a tool, like a good night's sleep, that everyone should be permitted to use if they choose? None of these questions have clean answers. The universities that attempted to address non-medical stimulant use primarily did so through enforcement, tighter prescription monitoring, drug testing in competitive academic programs, rather than through the harder conversation about what kind of cognitive enhancement culture they were inadvertently cultivating. If regular Adderall was a useful tool, Adderall XR, the extended release formulation approved in 2001, was the pharmaceutical industry's attempt to make that tool less disruptive. The XR stood for extended release, and the mechanism was elegant. Tiny beads inside each capsule were coated with different thicknesses of polymer, so they dissolved at different rates, releasing their amphetamine payload gradually over the course of 8 to 12 hours instead of all at once. The result was a medication that could theoretically cover a full school or workday with a single morning dose, no midday pill, no trip to the nurse's office, no awkward moment of explaining to a co-worker why you needed to take a tablet with your lunch. For children in particular, the social and logistical benefits were significant. For the pharmaceutical company, the benefits were also significant. A new patent, a new formulation, a new marketing cycle on the same molecule. Extended release technology would become the dominant approach in ADHD pharmacology from this point forward, and Adderall XR would become one of the most recognized prescription drug names in American history, which is a strange achievement when you consider that it is essentially a very carefully timed bag of salts. The bead technology inside Adderall XR capsules is worth a moment of genuine appreciation. Each capsule contains 2 types of beads: immediate release beads, which dissolve in stomach acid and release their amphetamine content quickly, and delayed release beads, which have a special polymer coating that resists stomach acid and does not dissolve until the beads move further along into the small intestine. Approximately half the beads are immediate release, producing the initial therapeutic effect within 30 to 60 minutes of taking the capsule. The other half release their content 3 to 4 hours later, extending the duration of effect without requiring a second dose. The shape of the blood concentration curve is therefore roughly biphasic, 2 peaks rather than 1, which smooths the ride significantly compared to taking 2 separate immediate release doses at different times. Whether you feel this difference as a patient is highly individual, many people do, some do not. But the pharmacokinetic curve looks better on paper, and in medicine as in marketing, looking better on paper has consequences. The social value of extended release formulations for children was real and not reducible to pharmaceutical convenience. Before extended release medications, children on Ritalin typically needed a midday dose that had to be administered by a school nurse. This created several problems. First, children had to leave class, walk to the nurse's office, and take their medication in a context that identified them to their peers as different, medicated, special, carrying a diagnosis. In the brutal social calculus of elementary school, this visibility had genuine costs. Second, many schools lacked reliable nursing coverage, and the dose was frequently missed or delayed, producing an afternoon collapse in function that teachers and parents both noticed and neither could easily prevent. Third, the stigma was not just social, it was the child's own experience of their difference. An extended release medication taken once at breakfast before leaving home was invisible. Nobody at school needed to know. The condition could be managed without being displayed. This was not a trivial improvement. It was the difference between a child who could participate in the social life of their classroom and one who could not. And that difference accumulates over years into something that matters a great deal. The commercial logic of extended release formulations is equally transparent. Brand name Adderall went generic in 2002, 1 year after Adderall XR was introduced. This was not a coincidence. When a pharmaceutical company's blockbuster drug approaches patent expiration, the standard playbook involves introducing a reformulation. Same molecule, new delivery mechanism, new patentee that the company can then actively promote while the original goes generic. Adderall XR's patent gave Shire protection from generic competition until approximately 2009. During that window, the company marketed Adderall XR aggressively as a superior option to both generic Adderall and generic Ritalin, and the prescribing patterns shifted accordingly. This is not illegal. It is not unusual. It is the pharmaceutical industry working as designed, and the fact that the reformulation also offered genuine patient benefits makes the moral accounting genuinely complicated rather than simply cynical. In 2008, Shire introduced Vyvanse, lisdexamphetamine, and it was, in pharmacological terms, a genuinely clever piece of engineering. Lisdexamphetamine is what chemists call a prodrug. It is not active in the form you swallow it. Instead, it is dextroamphetamine, the same active molecule in dexedrine, attached to a lysine amino acid like a sleeping passenger on a train. When you take it, your body's enzymes cleave the lysine off in a slow, steady process that happens primarily in red blood cells, releasing dextroamphetamine gradually over many hours. The effect is long, smooth, and consistent. The peak is lower and the duration longer than Adderall XR, and because the drug is inactive until metabolized, it is significantly harder to abuse by crushing and snorting, a genuine safety improvement. It is also significantly more expensive, at peak, around $300 a month without insurance. Critics pointed out that once the Adderall XR patent expired and generics flooded the market, Vyvanse arrived conveniently to give Shire a new proprietary product to sell. The pharmacology was real, so was the business strategy. Both things were true at the same time, which is a sentence that describes most of pharmaceutical history. The lysine conjugate design is one of those rare pharmaceutical innovations that solves multiple problems simultaneously. The primary problem it solved was abuse liability. Amphetamine, when snorted or injected rather than swallowed, produces a rapid spike in plasma and brain concentration that creates a much more intense euphoric effect than oral dosing. This rapid spike is the pharmacological basis for most stimulant abuse. The rush, the high, the feature of the drug that makes it rewarding in a way that is separate from and much more intense than its therapeutic effect. When you snort lisdexamphetamine, the drug enters the bloodstream intact and still has to be enzymatically cleaved in the red blood cells before it becomes active, a process that happens at the same rate regardless of how quickly the drug reached the blood. The sharp concentration spike that makes snorting amphetamine rewarding simply does not occur with lisdexamphetamine because the activation step is rate limited by enzymatic capacity rather than by absorption. The drug essentially cannot be abused in the same way. This was, at the time of approval, a meaningful pharmacological advance in a therapeutic category with genuine abuse concerns. The second thing the prodrug design addressed was consistency. Because the release of active dextroamphetamine from lisdexamphetamine depends on enzymatic activity in the blood rather than on the dissolution rate of a bead coating or an osmotic membrane, the pharmacokinetics are highly reproducible across different individuals and across different days in the same individual. Factors that disrupt extended-release bead formulations, eating a high-fat meal before the dose, variations in gastric pH, differences in intestinal motility, do not affect lisdexamphetamine's release rate in the same way. Patients on Vyvanse consistently reported a very reliable, predictable effect compared to other extended-release formulations. The drug started working at the same time each morning. It lasted the same duration. The end of the day felt predictable. For people managing ADHD alongside demanding work schedules, this consistency was genuinely valuable. Shire also obtained approval for Vyvanse in a binge eating disorder indication in 2015, the first medication approved for that condition, which broadened the market and extended the commercial life of the molecule significantly. The binge eating disorder application was clinically meaningful. Lisdexamphetamine reduced binge eating episodes in clinical trials, likely through its effects on dopaminergic reward circuitry, and it offered a pharmacological treatment option for a condition with limited alternatives. It also, critics noted, dramatically expanded the population of people who could be prescribed the drug. By the mid-2010s, Vyvanse had become one of the best-selling branded pharmaceuticals in the United States, generating several $1 billion annually in revenue. The patent has since expired in the US, and generic Listic's amphetamine is now available, which has brought the price down significantly, though it remains one of the more expensive generic ADHD medications on the market due to the complexity of its synthesis. While Adderall was dominating the conversation, the methylphenidate family was not standing still. In 2000, McNeil Pharmaceuticals introduced Concerta, an extended-release methylphenidate product built around a delivery technology called OROS, Osmotic Release Oral System. The pill looked unremarkable. What was happening inside it was not. The capsule contained a tiny pump. As water from your digestive system entered through a semi-permeable membrane, it pushed the drug out through a tiny laser-drilled hole at a controlled rate over 12 hours. The first 22% of the dose released immediately. The remaining 78% trickled out in a rising arc that mimicked how an immediate release dose would look if you took it 3 times across a day. The result was smooth, sustained coverage without the peaks and valleys that shorter-acting formulations produced. Concerta became enormously popular for children who needed all-day coverage, at school, and into the evening homework hours, and for adults who wanted to take something once in the morning and not think about it again. The pill itself passed through you mostly intact, which alarmed parents who saw it in the toilet and thought the medication wasn't working. It was. The OROS technology was developed by the Alza Corporation, which had pioneered osmotic delivery systems across multiple drug categories. The basic principle exploits a fundamental property of osmosis, the movement of water across a semi-permeable membrane from regions of lower solute concentration to regions of higher concentration. The Concerta tablet has a semi-permeable membrane with a laser-drilled hole of precisely calibrated diameter. Inside the tablet are compartments, one containing drug in a drug layer and another containing an osmotic agent in a push layer. As the patient swallows the tablet and it enters the digestive system, water from the gut gradually penetrates the semi-permeable membrane and causes the push layer to expand. As the push layer expands, it squeezes the drug layer out through the laser-drilled hole at a controlled, steady rate. The release rate depends on the geometry of the tablet, the properties of the membrane, and the characteristics of the push layer, all of which can be engineered to produce a specific pharmacokinetic profile. The rising arc of drug delivery that Concerta achieves, starting lower and increasing through the day, was designed to match the fact that attention demands tend to increase as the school day progresses. The visible ghost tablet in the toilet became one of the memorable quirks of Concerta use, and it generated enough parental anxiety to require a specific section in the prescribing information. Parents who observed a pill-shaped object in their child's stool, intact, recognizable, looking entirely like a tablet that had passed through the body without dissolving, understandably assumed the medication had not been absorbed. What they were seeing was the inert shell of the OROS mechanism. The drug had been pushed out through the laser-drilled hole and absorbed normally. The shell remained because it was not designed to dissolve, only to serve as the pump. The medication was working. The toilet was just performing the alarming but ultimately uninformative function of displaying the hardware. This is one of those details that sounds like a minor issue of patient education, until you consider how many families discontinued an effective medication because they concluded, entirely reasonably but entirely incorrectly, that their child was not absorbing it. Concerta's 12-hour coverage profile made it genuinely useful for children whose needs extended beyond the traditional school day into homework time, into afternoon activities, into the evening hours when family functioning required the same level of organization and impulse control that the classroom had. This was a period when awareness of ADHD's impact outside school settings was growing, and when the previous generation of ADHD treatment, focused entirely on classroom performance, was being recognized as incomplete. Concerta offered a pharmacological solution to the problem of afternoon and evening function without requiring a separate short-acting booster dose, which was the previous standard of care and which carried its own set of problems around sleep timing and appetite suppression. It became the dominant extended-release methylphenidate product in the United States market and remained so until generic competition arrived, which it did after the oral's patent expired, with considerable controversy about whether the generics truly replicated the oral's pharmacokinetic profile. The answer, it turned out, was complicated. If dexedrine was what happened when chemists separated the two halves of amphetamine to use only the more effective one, Focalin was what happened when they did the same thing with methylphenidate. Regular methylphenidate contains two mirror image forms of the molecule, D-methylphenidate and L-methylphenidate. The D form does the heavy lifting. It is more potent, more active in the brain, and responsible for the majority of the therapeutic effect. The L form contributes less to efficacy, but does contribute to cardiovascular side effects like elevated heart rate. Novartis isolated just the D form and sold it as dexmethylphenidate, branded as Focalin, approved in 2001. Because you were using only the active half, the effective dose was roughly half of what you'd need with regular Ritalin, which sounded like an advantage. In clinical reality, many patients found Focalin sharper and quicker to onset than standard methylphenidate, which some liked and some found too abrupt. Focalin XR extended the concept to a longer-acting formulation. It carved out its own niche in the ADHD market, not dominant, not obscure, just quietly useful for the patients it suited, which, as pharmacological careers go, is a respectable outcome. The science behind enantiomer separation in methylphenidate follows the same logic as the separation in amphetamine, but with some important practical differences. In the case of amphetamine, the D form is roughly 3 to 4 times more potent than the L form in the central nervous system. In the case of methylphenidate, the asymmetry is even more pronounced. D-methylphenidate is estimated to be 10 to 30 times more pharmacologically active than L-methylphenidate at dopamine and norepinephrine transporters. L-methylphenidate contributes almost nothing to the therapeutic effect, but does contribute to the peripheral effects, the cardiovascular activation, the slight increase in heart rate and blood pressure that come with any drug that activates the sympathetic nervous system. By isolating only the D form, the theoretical benefit is a drug that provides the same central therapeutic effect with less peripheral stimulation, a better signal-to-noise ratio at the molecular level. In practice, the clinical difference between racemic methylphenidate and dexmethylphenidate was smaller than the pharmacological theory would predict. Most clinical trials comparing Focalin to Ritalin at equivalent doses found similar efficacy and similar side effect profiles. The patients who reported the clearest subjective difference were those who found the onset of regular methylphenidate uncomfortable, a sharp, slightly jarring quality at the beginning of the effect, and who found that Focalin, with its somewhat different pharmacokinetic curve, produced a cleaner transition into therapeutic effect. This is genuinely individual. Many patients do not notice any difference at all. Some strongly prefer the D-enantiomer. The clinical practice of trying multiple medications and formulations before settling on one is not arbitrary. It reflects the genuine reality that individual response to similar drugs varies enough to make empirical testing the only reliable approach. Focalin XR uses the same bimodal bead technology as Adderall XR. Some beads release immediately, some release 4 hours later, to produce an extended effect over 8 to 10 hours. It occupies a particular niche in the treatment landscape. Patients who have tried racemic methylphenidate preparations and found them effective but slightly rough at the edges, who want the familiarity of the methylphenidate mechanism with a slightly cleaner delivery. It has never captured the market share of Concerta or Adderall XR, partly because its differentiation from existing medications is subtle enough that many prescribers do not reach for it first, and partly because its patent structure meant it faced generic competition relatively quickly. But it fills its role with quiet competence, which is more than can be said for many pharmaceutical experiments that never made it this far. Here is the part where we slow down and be honest. ADHD stimulants are real medications with real side effects, and while they help millions of people, they do not do so without cost. The most common, appetite suppression. Stimulants activate the body's sympathetic nervous system, which in evolutionary terms is the system that says you're being chased by something, and this is not the time to eat a sandwich. Lunch disappears from the agenda, weight loss follows. In children, this creates genuine concern about growth. In adults, it is frequently treated as a bonus feature, which is a complicated thing to say out loud but is widely true. Sleep disruption is the other major one. Take a stimulant too late in the day, and your brain will still be vigorously awake at midnight wondering whether you should refinish the kitchen cabinets. Heart rate and blood pressure rise modestly. Mood changes happen. Irritability as the drug wears off is common enough that it has its own name, the Adderall crash. And then there is the psychological dimension. Some people feel flattened on stimulants, like the drug took the volume down on everything, including the things they liked about themselves. That experience is real, it is not talked about enough, and it is one of the reasons medication adjustment matters more than most prescribers communicate. Appetite suppression is perhaps the most universally reported side effect of stimulant ADHD medications, and its mechanism is straightforward enough. Stimulants activate the hypothalamus, the brain region that regulates hunger and satiety, in a way that suppresses appetite signals. They also cause the release of norepinephrine, which activates the sympathetic fight-or-flight system, and in that system, hunger is not a priority. The result is that many people on stimulants simply do not feel hungry during the medicated part of their day. They can eat if reminded or if they make a deliberate effort. They are not physically incapable of consuming food, they just do not want to. For adults, the practical consequence is frequently skipped meals, inadequate caloric intake, and the uncomfortable discovery that the medication wore off at 6 in the evening and left behind the accumulated hunger of a missed breakfast and lunch, arriving all at once in the form of a consuming desire to eat an entire kitchen. This rebound hunger is common enough to be its own inconvenience, distinct from the appetite suppression it follows. For children, the stakes are different. Consistent caloric restriction during the growing years can affect height. Long-term studies suggest the effect on final adult height is real but modest, roughly half an inch on average, but modest in a statistical sense is not the same as 0 for a particular child, and the monitoring of growth trajectory is a standard and important part of pediatric ADHD treatment. Sleep disruption takes several forms. Some people find that stimulants taken even in the early morning produce a residual activating effect that delays sleep onset by an hour or two at bedtime. Others find that the crash as the drug wears off brings a crash in mood and a restless, dissatisfied quality that makes settling down difficult. The interaction between stimulants and sleep architecture, the stages of sleep, particularly slow wave and REM sleep, is not fully understood, but there is evidence that stimulants can reduce sleep quality even in people who fall asleep without difficulty. This matters because sleep deprivation reliably worsens the cognitive symptoms of ADHD, creating a cycle in which the medication that is supposed to help creates conditions that partially undo the help it provides. Managing the timing of doses relative to sleep, sometimes adding melatonin or adjusting to a shorter-acting afternoon preparation, is a meaningful part of optimizing ADHD treatment, and one that often requires patience and trial and error. The emotional side effects are the hardest to describe and the most variable across individuals. Some people on stimulants experience a muted emotional range, less laughter, less spontaneous joy, a functional but slightly grey quality to the day that is preferable to the chaos of untreated ADHD, but is not the same as feeling fully alive. Others experience the opposite: better emotional regulation, fewer emotional outbursts, a steadiness that allows them to engage with their lives without the impulsive reactivity that ADHD can produce. A significant subset experiences rebound irritability in the late afternoon as the medication wears off, a predictable window of low tolerance, quick frustration, and difficulty managing ordinary demands that family members often notice before the person taking the medication does. Acknowledging these effects honestly, discussing them with a prescriber, and being willing to adjust dose, timing, or formulation is the difference between a medication regimen that works in a full human sense and one that works only on paper. Not everyone can take stimulants. They have a history of heart problems. They have a history of substance use disorder. They have anxiety that gets dramatically worse on anything that activates the sympathetic nervous system. They are a child whose parents are philosophically opposed to putting amphetamines into a 7-year-old, which is a position medicine can at least engage with. For all of these people, Eli Lilly developed Strattera, atomoxetine, approved by the FDA in 2002. Strattera was the first non-stimulant specifically approved for ADHD, and it worked on an entirely different mechanism. Rather than flooding the synapse with dopamine and norepinephrine, it selectively inhibited the reuptake of norepinephrine. Think of it as a quieter, slower tool aimed at a different part of the system. It took weeks to work rather than hours. It produced no immediate euphoria and no real abuse potential. It did not appear on controlled substance schedules, and its effect for the patients it suited was real, not identical to stimulants, but meaningful. It was also, in many patients, harder to tolerate. Nausea was common in the early weeks. Emotional blunting was reported, and the delayed onset meant that people who expected to feel different on day one sometimes gave up before the drug had a chance to do its job. Atomoxetine's mechanism of action is selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibition, a term that will be familiar to anyone who has read about antidepressants, because the same mechanism underlies the SNRI class of antidepressants like Effexor and Cymbalta. Atomoxetine was actually developed as an antidepressant before researchers discovered its utility in ADHD. In clinical trials for depression, it underperformed against existing antidepressants, but the observation that patients reported improved attention and concentration led to trials in ADHD populations where it performed significantly better. The fact that it is a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor rather than a stimulant means it does not produce the immediate psychoactive effects that give stimulants their appeal to people seeking a recreational experience. There is no rush, there is no euphoria, there is no particular reason to take it if you do not have ADHD. This is what made it possible to market as a non-controlled substance, which solved a real problem for prescribers who were uncomfortable with the legal and administrative burden of prescribing Schedule II medications, particularly for patients who were difficult to monitor closely. The weeks-long onset was both scientifically interesting and practically frustrating. Unlike stimulants, which produce an immediately perceptible effect within an hour of the first dose, atomoxetine requires sustained daily dosing for 2 to 4 weeks before the full therapeutic benefit emerges. The mechanism appears to involve changes in gene expression and receptor density that develop gradually. The norepinephrine reuptake inhibition is present from the first dose, but its downstream effects on prefrontal cortex function take time to stabilize. This delayed onset meant that patients and families who were accustomed to the immediate feedback of stimulant treatment, within hours whether this medication is helping, had to tolerate weeks of uncertainty before reaching a conclusion about whether atomoxetine was going to work. Many did not make it that far. The dropout rate during the initial titration period was high, and a significant fraction of patients who might have eventually benefited from the drug stopped taking it during the period before the benefit had manifested. Patient education about the timeline was and remains critically important with this medication. For patients who stayed with it long enough to reach therapeutic effect, atomoxetine offered a genuinely different quality of benefit from stimulants. Many reported a smoother, more even-keeled day, less sharp than stimulants, without the peaks and valleys, and without the end-of-day crash that amphetamine-based medications commonly produced. Because it was taken once daily with consistent blood levels across the full 24 hours, it provided coverage at times when stimulants were typically inactive, evenings, weekends, the first hours of the morning before a stimulant dose would kick in. Patients who found that their ADHD significantly affected their relationships and family functioning, rather than primarily their work performance, sometimes found atomoxetine's around-the-clock coverage more suited to their specific needs than the time-limited coverage of a stimulant. It was not, and is not, the right medication for everyone, but for the patients it suited, it filled a gap that stimulants left open. Here is a medication that came to ADHD treatment the way many things come to ADHD treatment, sideways, by accident, through the observation that it was helping people with something it was never meant to address. Bupropion, sold as Wellbutrin, is an antidepressant. It inhibits the reuptake of both dopamine and norepinephrine, the same neurotransmitters affected by stimulants, but less potently and through a different mechanism. It was approved for depression in 1985, and clinicians noticed fairly early that patients with co-occurring ADHD and depression seemed to get a double benefit. Formal studies followed. Bupropion is not FDA approved for ADHD. It has never cleared that particular regulatory hurdle, but it is prescribed off-label for it regularly, particularly in adults, particularly in those who cannot tolerate stimulants, and particularly in those whose ADHD arrives wrapped in a layer of depression and anxiety that makes the stimulant picture complicated. It is not as potent as the frontline medications. It has its own side effect profile, including lowered seizure threshold and a distinctive reputation for vivid dreams. But for a subset of patients, it threads a needle that other drugs cannot, and in medicine, that is worth a great deal. The off-label use of medications is more common than most patients realize, and more legally straightforward than it sounds. When the FDA approves a drug, it approves it for a specific indication based on clinical trial data. But physicians are legally permitted to prescribe any approved drug for any condition they believe, based on clinical judgment and available evidence, may benefit the patient. Off-label prescribing is not experimental in any meaningful sense when the evidence base for the use is substantial. Bupropion for ADHD is supported by multiple controlled clinical trials, systematic reviews, and decades of clinical experience. The reason it has not obtained an official ADHD indication is not that the evidence is absent. It is that the financial investment required for an FDA indication makes sense only when the expected return justifies the cost, and given that bupropion is now generic, there is no commercial entity with sufficient financial incentive to fund the additional trials and regulatory process. The drug works. It is just working without an official label for that particular purpose. Bupropion's mechanism in ADHD is thought to operate primarily through its dopamine reuptake inhibition, the same neurotransmitter system targeted by stimulants, but through a different molecular mechanism and with less potency. Unlike the classical dopamine transporter blockers like methylphenidate, bupropion inhibits dopamine reuptake through a more indirect mechanism and also has effects at nicotinic acetylcholine receptors that may contribute to its therapeutic effect on attention. Its norepinephrine reuptake inhibition adds the same prefrontal sharpening mechanism provided by atomoxetine. The combined effect is modest by stimulant standards, but meaningful for patients who cannot or will not take stimulants and who need something that provides at least partial support for the same neurochemical systems. The dose-response relationship is less steep than with stimulants, which makes titration less sensitive and the risk of getting the dose wrong in either direction somewhat lower. The seizure risk associated with bupropion is real but context-dependent. The risk is dose-dependent. It is highest at doses above the recommended maximum, and it is elevated in patients with a personal or family history of seizure disorder, eating disorders, or significant alcohol use. At therapeutic doses in patients without these risk factors, the absolute seizure risk is low, but not zero, and it is the reason bupropion is not prescribed to patients in eating disorder recovery. The vivid dreams that many patients on bupropion report are a common enough phenomenon to be listed routinely in prescribing information and to generate their own subculture of anecdote online. They are not dangerous. They are occasionally entertaining. They are the kind of side effect that most patients either adapt to quickly or find strange enough to bring up at the next appointment, and the medication's overall profile makes them a manageable inconvenience rather than a reason to stop. The history of ADHD pharmacology is filled with medications that arrived from somewhere else entirely and found an unexpected second life in the attention deficit clinic. Guanfacine and clonidine were both developed as blood pressure medications. They worked by activating receptors in the prefrontal cortex and elsewhere that reduced norepinephrine signaling, which lowered vascular tone and heart rate, but also, as it turned out, had a calming and organizing effect on executive function in ADHD brains. Clonidine was the first to be used off-label for ADHD in the 1980s, primarily in children who were hyperactive and impulsive, and who either couldn't take stimulants or needed something to address the wild mood swings and sleep problems that stimulants alone weren't fixing. Guanfacine, extended release, branded as Intuniv, received formal FDA approval for ADHD in 2009. These medications are not stimulants. They do not produce focus in the sharp, immediate way that amphetamines do. What they do is reduce hyperactivity and impulsivity, improve working memory, and take the edge off the emotional dysregulation that sits at the center of ADHD for many people, and that the stimulant-focused narrative of the condition frequently fails to address. Clonidine and guanfacine belong to a drug class called alpha-2 adrenergic agonists. They work by activating alpha-2 receptors, a subtype of adrenergic receptor that is particularly concentrated in the prefrontal cortex and in the brainstem. In the brainstem, activating these receptors reduces the release of norepinephrine and lowers blood pressure. The original intended effect that made these drugs valuable as antihypertensives. In the prefrontal cortex, the story is more nuanced. Alpha-2 receptors in the prefrontal cortex, when activated, actually improve the signal-to-noise ratio in working memory circuits. They reduce the noise, the distracting internal and external inputs that compete with the current task, and strengthen the signal, the task-relevant information that needs to be held in mind. The net effect on ADHD symptoms is a reduction in impulsivity and hyperactivity, an improvement in working memory, and a calming of the emotional reactivity that makes transitions, frustrations, and changes in plans so disproportionately difficult for many people with ADHD. Clonidine's entry into ADHD treatment was driven by a specific clinical need. In the 1980s, as Ritalin prescriptions were expanding, clinicians began encountering children for whom stimulants made things worse rather than better. Children whose hyperactivity turned into agitation, whose sleep problems intensified rather than improved, and whose behaviour became more unpredictable rather than less. Some of these children had co-occurring anxiety or mood disorders that were exacerbated by stimulant activation. Others were simply on the wrong medication. Clonidine offered a mechanistically different option that calmed without activating, and early reports of its effectiveness in hyperactive children with tic disorders, where stimulants were considered relatively contraindicated, gave it a specific clinical niche that expanded over time. It also had a notable sedating effect, which made it useful as a bedtime dose for children whose ADHD-related sleep difficulties were not manageable by timing adjustments alone. Guanfacine is more selective than clonidine for the alpha-2A receptor subtype, which is the subtype most concentrated in the prefrontal cortex and most relevant to the cognitive and behavioral effects in ADHD. This selectivity means guanfacine produces less sedation than clonidine, a meaningful advantage in a pediatric population where daytime sedation is educationally and functionally costly. Intuniv, the extended-release formulation approved for ADHD, provides steady drug levels across the day without the peaks and troughs that made immediate-release guanfacine difficult to dose optimally. In clinical practice, alpha agonists are often used as adjuncts to stimulant medications rather than as monotherapy, added to an existing stimulant regimen to address residual hyperactivity, emotional dysregulation, or sleep difficulties that the stimulant alone is not adequately controlling. The combination of a stimulant for focus and an alpha agonist for impulse control and emotional regulation reflects a more nuanced understanding of ADHD as a condition with multiple symptom dimensions that may require different pharmacological approaches to address fully. In 2022, something happened that millions of Americans with ADHD felt in extremely immediate and personal ways. The stimulant supply chain broke. An Adderall shortage, driven by a combination of manufacturing capacity issues, pandemic-related disruptions to supply and demand, regulatory limits on how much amphetamine could be produced, and a post-pandemic surge in telehealth ADHD diagnoses that dramatically increased the number of prescriptions being written. All of these things collided at once. Pharmacy shelves were empty. People called 12 pharmacies before finding their medication. Prescriptions couldn't be transferred to different formulations easily because stimulants are Schedule II controlled substances, meaning every change required a new paper prescription from the prescriber. Adults who had managed their ADHD for years found themselves abruptly unmedicated, rediscovering in real time what their brains felt like without the thing that had been quietly making their lives functional. The shortage became a news story, then a policy conversation, then a regulatory investigation. It also became, for many people, the first time they had clearly articulated evidence of how much the medication was doing for them, because they now knew precisely what its absence felt like. The regulatory architecture surrounding Schedule II stimulants is the structural reason why the shortage became a crisis rather than an inconvenience. Under the Controlled Substances Act, the DEA sets annual production quotas for Schedule II substances, the maximum amount of each controlled drug that can be manufactured in the United States in a given year. The quota system was designed to prevent the overproduction of potentially addictive drugs. It made reasonable sense when it was designed. It did not adequately account for the possibility that demand would increase faster than the quota adjustment process could accommodate, particularly when that demand increase was driven by a genuine increase in diagnosis rather than by recreational use. The quota for amphetamine-based medications had been set at levels that assumed a relatively stable prescription volume. When telehealth-driven diagnosis expanded the patient population significantly and rapidly, the manufacturing capacity, constrained by the quota, could not keep up. The shortage was, in part, a regulatory artifact of a system designed for a different era. The manufacturing side of the problem was separate and compounding. Amphetamine production in the United States is highly concentrated, A small number of manufacturers produce the vast majority of the active pharmaceutical ingredient, and those manufacturers operate in facilities that require DEA licensing, specialized equipment, and tightly controlled processes. When one manufacturer experiences a production disruption, an equipment failure, a facility issue, a quality control problem, there is limited redundancy in the system. The shortage that began in 2022 involved simultaneous disruptions at multiple manufacturers, including Teva Pharmaceuticals, which was the dominant supplier of generic Adderall. The disruption at Teva rippled outward through the entire supply chain because no other manufacturer had the capacity to absorb Teva's volume on short notice, and the regulatory process for increasing production required advance notice and DEA approval that could not happen quickly. The human experience of the shortage deserves attention because it revealed something important about the relationship between ADHD medication and functional capacity that is not always visible when the medication is working. Adults who had been managing successful careers, maintaining relationships, and functioning in complex environments found that losing their medication was not merely an inconvenience. It was, for many of them, a collapse of the scaffolding that their lives were built on. Tasks that had been manageable became overwhelming. The sense of drowning that they had experienced before diagnosis and treatment returned, often with the additional complexity of knowing it was solvable, that there was a medication that would fix it, and being unable to access that medication for reasons entirely outside their control. The shortage and the experience of its absence became for many people the clearest possible articulation of how much the medication mattered. It also generated real and deserved anger at a system that had decided their medication was adequately available when it was not. Between 2020 and 2023, the number of ADHD diagnoses in adults in the United States increased dramatically, and a significant portion of that increase ran through telehealth platforms. The pandemic had expanded access to mental health care in ways both beneficial and complicated. Platforms like Cerebral and Done allowed users to describe their symptoms, complete a screening questionnaire, and receive a stimulant prescription in a single appointment, often shorter than a routine physical. Critics said this was reckless. Prescribers with 10 minutes of patient contact were making Schedule II decisions. Supporters said this was access, that the millions of adults who had been undiagnosed for decades, particularly women, people of colour, and people without easy access to in-person psychiatry, were finally getting help that had always been there for them in theory and almost never in practice. Both things contained truth. The FDA and the DEA began investigating some platforms for potentially inadequate evaluation standards. Several pivoted or shut down. And the broader question, who deserves a diagnosis, what does a valid diagnosis require, and who has historically been gatekeeping it, remained open, uncomfortable, and deeply worth asking. The expansion of telehealth mental health services during the COVID-19 pandemic was partly a matter of necessity and partly a matter of regulatory suspension. Prior to the pandemic, federal regulations required that Schedule II controlled substances could only be prescribed after an in-person evaluation, a rule designed to prevent prescription mills from operating entirely through phone or internet consultations. In March of 2020, as the pandemic began and in-person medical care became either unavailable or dangerous for much of the country, the DEA issued emergency authorizations allowing the prescribing of controlled substances via telehealth without a prior in-person evaluation. This was a reasonable response to an extraordinary situation. It also opened a window that a number of companies moved through very quickly. Telehealth platforms with ADHD as a focus area expanded aggressively. They recruited prescribers, marketed to consumers, streamlined the evaluation process, and began operating at scales that traditional psychiatric practices could not match. The quality of evaluations on these platforms varied enormously. Some employed qualified psychiatrists and nurse practitioners who conducted thorough assessments. Others used screening questionnaires administered by unlicensed staff and processed by prescribers who spent very little time with each patient. The ADHD diagnosis, to be done properly, requires a clinical interview that covers current symptoms, developmental history, functional impairment across multiple domains, and the exclusion of alternative explanations for the symptoms. It is not a checklist process. A short telehealth appointment is not inherently incompatible with a good evaluation. An experienced clinician can gather the necessary information efficiently, but the incentive structures of volume-based telehealth platforms did not always encourage thoroughness. The criticism from the psychiatric establishment was not that telehealth ADHD diagnosis was impossible to do well. It was that the specific models being deployed at scale were not doing it well. The access argument deserves to be taken seriously alongside the quality argument, because they are not the same argument. Traditional ADHD evaluation in the United States has historically been slow, expensive, and inaccessible for large portions of the population. A comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation can cost several $1,000s and take months to schedule. Even a straightforward psychiatric evaluation for ADHD requires finding a psychiatrist who accepts new patients, and your insurance, scheduling an appointment that may be weeks away, and travelling to an in-person location, a set of barriers that systematically excluded people who were lower income, underinsured, geographically rural, or belonging to demographic groups who faced additional barriers to mental health care. The explosion of telehealth diagnosis brought ADHD evaluations to many people who had previously had no realistic access to them. Whether the evaluation they received was adequate is a separate question from whether they deserve to have access to one. Both questions matter, and answering one does not answer the other. For the majority of ADHD's clinical history, the condition was understood primarily through the lens of hyperactive boys who couldn't sit still in class. The research was conducted mostly on boys. The diagnostic criteria were written around boys. The teachers who referred children for evaluation were more likely to refer the ones who disrupted the classroom, which, for a variety of reasons having to do with gendered behavioural expectations, were more often boys. Girls with ADHD tended to present differently. They were more likely to be predominantly inattentive rather than hyperactive, more daydreamy than disruptive, more likely to internalise the chaos rather than externalise it. They were called spacey, scatterbrained, underachievers who weren't applying themselves. They learned to mask, to compensate, to manage the appearance of functionality while spending enormous energy on something that was supposed to come naturally. They reached adulthood undiagnosed, in large numbers, and frequently arrived at the psychiatrist's office in their 30s or 40s, often after a child of theirs was diagnosed, with the specific exhaustion of someone who's been white-knuckling it for 20 years and just learned there was a name for why. The research literature on sex differences in ADHD presentation has expanded considerably over the past 2 decades, and what it reveals is both pharmacologically and clinically important. Girls with ADHD are more likely to present with the inattentive subtype, and less likely to present with the hyperactive impulsive subtype. They are more likely to show emotional dysregulation, mood disturbance, and anxiety as prominent features of their ADHD. They are more likely to internalize their difficulties, to develop self-critical narratives about their intelligence, their worth, and their capacity, rather than to externalize them through disruptive behavior, and they are more likely to develop compensatory strategies that mask the underlying deficit. They work twice as hard to appear half as organized, and from the outside they appear to be managing fine, which is precisely the appearance that makes teachers and parents less likely to refer them for evaluation and makes clinicians less likely to diagnose them when they present as adults. The hormonal dimension of ADHD in women adds another layer of complexity that the research is only beginning to map systematically. Estrogen appears to have a facilitating effect on dopamine and norepinephrine function, the same systems that ADHD medications target. During phases of the menstrual cycle when estrogen is low, many women with ADHD report that their symptoms worsen dramatically. This includes not just the attentional and executive function symptoms, but the emotional dysregulation and mood instability that characterize ADHD for many women. During perimenopause and menopause, as estrogen declines permanently, many women with ADHD report a significant worsening of their condition, sometimes to the point where previously manageable symptoms become functionally disabling. This hormonal interaction is poorly understood and largely unaddressed in standard ADHD treatment protocols. Doses that were therapeutic for a woman in her 30s may be inadequate in her late 40s. The interplay between estrogen, the dopamine system, and ADHD medication efficacy represents a significant gap in the research base that has real consequences for real people. Treatment of ADHD in women also has to account for reproductive considerations. Stimulant medications are classified as Category C for pregnancy, meaning animal studies have shown adverse fetal effects and there are no adequate human studies. The clinical reality is that many women become pregnant while taking ADHD medications, that the decision about whether to continue medication during pregnancy involves balancing real risks in both directions. The risks of the medication versus the risks of untreated ADHD during pregnancy, and that this is a decision that should involve careful discussion with a prescriber rather than a reflexive discontinuation or a reflexive continuation. The research on stimulant use during pregnancy is not as reassuring or as alarming as either extreme position suggests. It is in fact limited and genuinely uncertain, which means the conversation between patient and provider needs to be honest about what is and is not known, rather than performing a confidence that the data does not support. There is a particular kind of ADHD presentation that confuses almost everyone: clinicians, family members, and the person experiencing it most of all. It is sometimes called high-functioning ADHD, though that is not a clinical term. It is the version where intelligence, anxiety, perfectionism, or sheer willpower has been compensating for the disorganization for so long that from the outside nothing looks wrong. The person gets good grades, they hold down jobs, they appear capable and together. What cannot be seen is the enormous effort required to maintain that appearance. The hours spent rereading the same page, the elaborate coping systems that collapse when life gets complicated, the persistent sense of operating at 200% to achieve what everyone else seems to manage at 100. Masking is exhausting in a way that is difficult to communicate to people who do not experience it. When these people eventually seek diagnosis, often after a life event that overwhelms the coping infrastructure, they frequently encounter skepticism. They look fine. They functioned. Their history of achievement is used as evidence against them, and the irony is that the harder they work to manage their ADHD, the more convincingly they can appear to not have it. The concept of masking comes originally from the autism literature, where it describes the process by which autistic people learn to suppress or camouflage autistic behaviors in order to pass as neurotypical in social and professional contexts. The same process operates in ADHD, with similar costs. A highly intelligent child with ADHD may discover early that they can compensate for poor working memory by working harder and longer than peers, spending 3 hours on homework that takes other children 30 minutes and producing comparable or superior work. They learn that starting late, working in a rush under deadline pressure, and relying on the adrenaline of urgency produces the dopamine spike that makes focus possible. They build elaborate organizational systems. They set dozens of reminders. They triple-check everything. They arrive at adulthood with what appears to be from the outside a set of excellent compensatory habits. What they actually have is a set of emergency workarounds for a system that was never working efficiently to begin with, and those workarounds cost more energy than they appear to from the outside. The collapse typically comes when life complexity exceeds the bandwidth of the compensation strategies. A new baby, a job promotion with significantly greater demands, a relationship breakdown that takes cognitive and emotional bandwidth the system was already using fully, a move, a health crisis, a loss. Something changes, and suddenly the elaborate scaffolding that was holding everything up is not adequate for the new weight on it. The person who previously appeared to have everything under control finds, abruptly, that they do not, and they cannot understand why what always worked is no longer working, because they have never been in a life situation that exceeded the capacity of their compensatory strategies. This is often when the first diagnosis occurs. The person does not present to their doctor saying, "I have always been this way." They present saying, "I used to be fine and now I am not." And the ADHD that was always there suddenly becomes visible in the gap between what they could previously manage and what they can no longer manage. Skepticism from clinicians in these cases is both understandable and harmful. It is understandable because the diagnostic criteria for ADHD specify that symptoms should be present from childhood and should cause impairment across multiple domains, and a person presenting in their late 30s, having gone to college and built a career, does not obviously fit the picture of someone who was impaired from childhood. What the skeptical clinician is not fully accounting for is that compensation is not the same as absence of impairment. It is the same impairment at higher cost. The ADHD was always there. The impairment was always real. It was managed through a combination of intelligence, effort and circumstance until circumstances changed, enough to make the management insufficient. Treating the diagnosis history as straightforwardly reassuring, rather than as evidence that this person has been working very hard to appear not disabled, while being quite disabled, is a clinical error with real consequences. Somewhere between 40 and 60% of adults with ADHD also have an anxiety disorder, which is a statistic that makes prescribing decisions significantly more complicated, because stimulants and anxiety are not always comfortable neighbours. Stimulants raise heart rate, create a sense of urgency, and activate the sympathetic nervous system in ways that can be interpreted by an already anxious brain as something going wrong. The result in some patients is a medication that improves focus, while also turning the background hum of worry into something louder and harder to ignore. Clinicians managing co-occurring ADHD and anxiety have to make judgment calls, sometimes adding a low-dose SSRI or SNRI alongside the stimulant, sometimes choosing a non-stimulant first, sometimes starting with a lower dose and titrating very slowly. There is no universal answer. What complicates this further is that untreated ADHD itself generates anxiety. The chronic experience of missing deadlines, forgetting things, underperforming, and feeling like you are perpetually behind creates a secondary layer of anxiety that has nothing to do with brain chemistry and everything to do with the accumulated evidence of a life that keeps slipping. Sometimes treating the ADHD reduces the anxiety. Sometimes the anxiety needs its own treatment. Often both are true. The relationship between ADHD and anxiety is bidirectional in ways that complicate the clinical picture significantly. On one hand, anxiety disorders frequently co-occur with ADHD as genuinely independent conditions, both having their own neurobiological underpinnings that happen to share a patient. On the other hand, chronic untreated ADHD reliably produces secondary anxiety that is a psychological response to repeated failure, social difficulty, and the exhaustion of constant compensatory effort, rather than a primary neurobiological disorder. These two types of anxiety look similar from the outside, but have different implications for treatment. Primary anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder existing alongside ADHD, may worsen with stimulant treatment and may require its own pharmacological management. Secondary anxiety, the worry and self-doubt that is the natural consequence of living with unmanaged ADHD, often resolves or diminishes significantly when the ADHD is effectively treated and the person's functional capacity improves. The practical challenge is that distinguishing these two types of anxiety is difficult, and getting it wrong in either direction has consequences. Treating what looks like anxiety with an SSRI in someone whose anxiety is actually secondary ADHD may suppress some of the symptoms while leaving the underlying condition entirely unaddressed. Starting a stimulant in someone whose primary anxiety is severe may destabilize their mental health before the ADHD benefits emerge. The most careful approach involves a thorough history-taking that specifically explores the relationship between anxiety and ADHD symptoms. Does the worry precede or follow the functional difficulties? Is the anxiety content specifically about performance and competence, or does it generalize to contexts where ADHD is not a factor? And a treatment sequencing decision based on which condition is causing greater current distress. For many patients, this sequencing conversation never happens because the appointment is too short. The clinician's comfort with ADHD is limited, or the patient themselves does not know that their two conditions are related and present them as separate problems. Medication strategies for ADHD with co-occurring anxiety include starting stimulants at very low doses and titrating extremely slowly, which allows the patient to distinguish the baseline anxiety from any anxiety exacerbated by the medication, and to find the dose threshold at which benefit exceeds the additional activation. Non-stimulant options like atomoxetine and the alpha-2 agonists tend to be better tolerated in anxious patients because they do not activate the sympathetic nervous system in the same way. And when stimulants are genuinely necessary but anxiety remains significant, adding a non-benzodiazepine anxiolytic or an SSRI can sometimes allow both conditions to be managed simultaneously without the medication interaction becoming problematic. What does not work is pretending the anxiety is not there, or assuming it will resolve on its own once the ADHD is treated, or avoiding any treatment because the picture is complicated. Complicated pictures deserve careful navigation, not avoidance. ADHD and sleep have one of the most destructive codependent relationships in all of neurology, and it goes in both directions simultaneously. Stimulant medications, if taken too late in the day, delay sleep onset, which leads to late nights, which leads to insufficient sleep, which leads to a brain that is less able to regulate attention the next morning, which leads to taking the medication, which leads to delayed sleep onset, and so on in a circle that many people with ADHD recognize intimately. But the relationship between ADHD and sleep disruption predates any medication. ADHD brains have difficulty shifting out of engaged states, what is sometimes called difficulty with sleep initiation, and a phenomenon called delayed sleep phase, where the internal clock runs later than the social schedule requires. The result is people who genuinely cannot fall asleep before midnight regardless of when they wake up, who then need to function on insufficient sleep, and whose ADHD symptoms worsen meaningfully with fatigue, because sleep deprivation and ADHD impair many of the same cognitive functions. Melatonin, sleep hygiene, and occasionally medication timing adjustments are the tools available. None of them are perfect. Many people with ADHD navigate this their entire lives with varying levels of success and an above-average familiarity with how 3 a.m. feels. The neurobiological basis of sleep disruption in ADHD is incompletely understood, but appears to involve the same dopaminergic and noradrenergic circuits that mediate wakefulness and attention during the day. The circadian rhythm, the internal biological clock that governs the timing of sleep and wakefulness, is regulated in part by dopamine signaling in the suprachiasmatic nucleus and in pathways connecting it to the broader arousal network. Dysregulation of dopamine in ADHD may contribute to the circadian phase delay that is commonly reported by ADHD patients, the persistent tendency to feel most alert in the late evening and most tired in the morning, running on a biological schedule that is shifted 2 or 3 hours later than the social schedule demands. This is not a character flaw. It is not laziness or poor sleep habits. It is a neurobiological timing difference that makes conventional sleep schedules genuinely difficult to maintain, and that is compounded by every morning alarm that forces the person to wake up before their circadian phase has completed its cycle. Sleep deprivation and ADHD create overlapping cognitive deficits that are difficult to disentangle. Both impair sustained attention, working memory, and response inhibition. Both increase emotional reactivity and reduce frustration tolerance. Both make it harder to initiate tasks, stay on task, and transition between tasks. For someone with ADHD who is also chronically sleep deprived, a situation that describes a substantial fraction of the ADHD population, the functional impairment is not simply the sum of the two conditions. It is potentially greater, because each condition undermines the coping strategies that might partially compensate for the other. The well-rested person with ADHD can sometimes use structure and compensatory strategies to manage executive function deficits. The sleep-deprived person with ADHD has fewer cognitive resources available for compensation and may find that previously functional strategies no longer work reliably. This is why sleep is not a supplementary concern in ADHD management. It's a primary variable that shapes whether any other intervention, pharmacological or behavioral, has room to work. Melatonin is by far the most studied sleep intervention in pediatric ADHD populations, and the evidence for its efficacy in reducing sleep onset latency, the time it takes to fall asleep, is reasonably good. The doses found effective in ADHD populations tend to be low, often 0.5 milligram to 3 milligrams rather than the 5 or 10 milligram doses sold in typical retail products, and the timing relative to desired sleep onset matters. Melatonin does not produce sedation in the way that sleeping pills do. It shifts the circadian phase earlier, which helps the ADHD brain begin to feel sleepy at a more socially reasonable hour. It does not work for everyone, and it does not solve the sleep problems that are driven by stimulant timing rather than by circadian dysregulation. But for the subset of ADHD patients whose sleep difficulties are primarily a circadian phase issue rather than a stimulant side effect, it is a useful tool with a genuinely benign safety profile. The internet discovered dopamine approximately 5 years ago, and what followed was a sustained misunderstanding that made neuroscientists quietly miserable. Dopamine became shorthand for pleasure, reward, motivation, and, in the worst cases, a substance that technology companies were allegedly weaponizing and that could be managed by fasting from stimulation in the style of a digital monk. The actual biology of dopamine is more complex than social media made it appear. Dopamine is not a pleasure chemical in any simple sense. It is more accurately a prediction and motivation signal. It fires in response to the anticipation of reward, to novelty, to the gap between what you expected and what you got. ADHD is not simply low dopamine. An ADHD medication does not simply top up a deficient tank. The reality involves receptor sensitivity, transporter efficiency, circuit-level differences across multiple brain systems, and individual variation that makes every person's neurological situation at least partly its own. None of this is well suited to a 3-minute explainer video, which is partly why the internet version of dopamine science is mostly vibes with a few real words scattered in, and partly why people with ADHD sometimes find that the wellness content about their condition has almost nothing to do with their actual experience of it. The dopamine fast, popularized on social media around 2019 and attributed primarily to a California psychologist, proposed that the overstimulation of the dopamine system by technology, social media, and modern life's constant novelty had created a kind of dopamine tolerance that made ordinary pleasures and activities feel less rewarding. The prescription was a period of abstinence from stimulating activities, screens, music, food variety, social interaction, intended to reset the dopamine system and restore sensitivity to ordinary rewards. The concept circulated widely online, generated considerable discussion, and contained approximately one genuine insight embedded in several significant misunderstandings. The genuine insight is that chronic exposure to highly stimulating activities can make low-stimulation activities feel less rewarding by comparison, a phenomenon that is real and documented. The misunderstandings include the idea that dopamine operates like a tank that gets depleted and refilled, that tolerance develops in the specific way described, and that brief abstinence from stimulation can meaningfully reset neuroreceptor density in any clinically relevant time frame. For people with ADHD, the dopamine fast concept is not just scientifically inaccurate, it is potentially actively harmful in how it frames the condition. If ADHD is characterized as dopamine-seeking behavior that has been pathologically rewarded by modern stimulation, the implication is that reducing stimulation will ameliorate the condition. This is backwards. ADHD is not caused by excessive dopamine stimulation. It is associated with a chronically understimulated dopamine system that drives the individual towards stimulation in order to achieve adequate baseline function. Reducing stimulation for a person with ADHD does not reset their dopamine system toward healthy function. It deprives a chronically understimulated brain of the inputs it is using to compensate for its own deficits. The ADHD person who puts down their phone to dopamine fast may find not a refreshed, newly sensitive reward system, but a more restless, more frustrated, less regulated brain with fewer of its usual coping tools. The wellness industry's confident simplification of a complicated neuroscience concept became, in this case, a recommendation that was not just useless but genuinely backwards for the population most enthusiastically adopting it. What the science does support is a more modest version of some of these ideas. There is evidence that high-stimulation digital environments can make sustained attention on low-stimulation tasks harder for everyone, including people without ADHD. There is evidence that certain patterns of technology use, particularly the variable ratio reinforcement schedules built into social media platforms, exploit dopaminergic anticipation circuits in ways that people find compulsive and ultimately unsatisfying. Managing these patterns is sensible for most people, but the mechanism is not dopamine exhaustion, and the solution is not fasting. It is more accurately described as cultivating habits of attention, in the same way that one would cultivate any other skill, deliberately, gradually, with environmental design rather than willpower, and with realistic expectations about how long it takes to build new patterns. That is less exciting than a dopamine fast. It is also more likely to work. When the patents on brand name ADHD medications expire, generic versions enter the market, and the price drops significantly, which is good. What is less straightforward is the experience of switching from a brand formulation to a generic, or from one generic to another when pharmacy supply chains shift. The FDA requires that generics be bioequivalent to the original cells, meaning that within a defined range, they deliver the same amount of active drug to the bloodstream. The range is not zero. It is plus or minus a specified percentage, and for most conditions that range is clinically meaningless. For ADHD medications, particularly extended-release formulations where the delivery mechanism is as important as the molecule, small differences in how the drug releases can feel significant to the person taking it. Different manufacturers use different bead technologies, different coatings, different excipients. The amount of active drug is equivalent on paper. The experience in the body can be genuinely different. People who insist that their brand medication feels different from a generic are not imagining things, or at least they may not be. The pharmacology of individual variation is real, and it is poorly served by a blanket reassurance that all generics are identical. The FDA bioequivalence standard specifies that a generic drug must demonstrate that its area under the plasma concentration time curve, the total amount of drug absorbed, falls within 80 to 125% of the reference drug's value with 90% confidence. This standard works well for immediate release formulations where the pharmacokinetic curve is a simple, single-peak absorption and elimination profile. For extended release formulations, the pharmacokinetic curve is considerably more complex. It has a specific shape, a rise, a plateau or a bimodal structure depending on the delivery technology, and a decline and bioequivalence standards that assess only the total area under the curve may allow formulations with very different shapes to pass as equivalent. A generic that delivers the same total amount of drug over 12 hours but releases it in a different pattern, faster early, slower late, or vice versa, can be bioequivalent by regulatory standards while producing a noticeably different clinical experience. The Concerta generic situation became a notable case study in this phenomenon. When the Concerta patent expired, multiple manufacturers introduced generic versions of methylphenidate formulated as extended-release tablets. Some used the original OROS mechanism and were licensed by the original patent holder as authorized generics. Others used different delivery technologies, bead-based systems, different polymer coatings that were not mechanistic copies of the OROS pump. Both types received FDA approval as bioequivalent to Concerta based on the pharmacokinetic equivalent standard. Both were cheaper than brand name Concerta, and both, according to a significant number of patients who switched, did not feel the same. Patient complaints accumulated sufficiently that the FDA eventually issued guidance acknowledging that some generic methylphenidate extended-release products used delivery technologies that did not replicate the OROS pharmacokinetic profile and might not be therapeutically equivalent in all patients. This was a significant admission that bioequivalence as legally defined was not the same as therapeutic equivalence as clinically experienced, and it vindicated patients whose reports had been dismissed as nocebo effect or psychological resistance to change. The practical implication for patients managing ADHD with generic medications is worth stating clearly. If a switch from brand to generic, or from one generic manufacturer to another, coincides with a change in how well the medication is working, that observation is legitimate clinical information rather than a psychosomatic response to label anxiety. Different generic manufacturers are not necessarily interchangeable, particularly for extended release products. If a specific generic product is working well, it is reasonable to request that the pharmacy consistently fill with the same manufacturer, a request that pharmacies can often but do not always accommodate, depending on their supplier relationships. If a new generic is not performing as expected, discussing the switch with a prescriber and potentially returning to the brand or to a different generic formulation is a reasonable clinical decision, rather than an unreasonable attachment to an expensive branded product. There is a specific emotional experience that accompanies a late ADHD diagnosis that is different from almost anything else in medicine. It is not just relief, though there is relief. It is not just validation, though there is that too. It is the experience of looking back across your entire life with a new lens and seeing, in sudden sharp focus, all the moments that make sense now in a way they did not before. The job you lost, the relationship that frayed, the project started and abandoned, the exhaustion that everyone told you was just the way adult life felt, the sense of being fundamentally broken in a way you couldn't explain or fix. People who receive ADHD diagnoses in their 30s, 40s or 50s frequently describe a period of grieving that surprises them, mourning the time spent struggling without understanding why, the achievements that were harder than they needed to be, and sometimes the version of themselves that might have existed if the diagnosis had come earlier. The grief is real and valid. So is the anger. And so, eventually, is the forward momentum. Because understanding the thing that has been difficult does not undo the past, but it does change what the next chapter looks like. The retrospective reorganization of a personal history around a new diagnosis is a well-documented psychological phenomenon. When a person who has been living with an undiagnosed condition finally receives a name for it, they often go through a period of intensive historical review, looking back at past events with a new interpretive framework and reinterpreting their significance. For ADHD, this process tends to be particularly extensive and emotionally loaded because the symptoms of ADHD, chronic disorganization, missed deadlines, impulsive decisions, relationship difficulties, career instability, have almost universally been explained to the undiagnosed person as character flaws rather than symptoms. You're not living up to your potential. You're not trying hard enough. You're irresponsible, flaky, careless, unreliable. You have so much potential and you keep wasting it. These messages, repeated over years and decades, become internalized. The person who finally receives a diagnosis in middle age is often not just receiving a medical explanation. They are receiving permission to reinterpret a lifetime of self-blame as something other than evidence of personal moral failure. The grief component of late diagnosis is specifically the grief for time, for the years spent struggling harder than necessary, for the relationships that might have been different, for the opportunities that might have been taken. This grief is sometimes dismissed by well-meaning people who point out that the person managed to achieve something despite the undiagnosed ADHD, and that the diagnosis arrives now with treatment options that can make the future different from the past. This is true and also beside the point. Grief does not require the absence of achievement. It does not require the presence of disaster. It requires only the recognition of a loss. In this case, the loss of a less difficult version of the life that was actually lived. Allowing that grief its space, rather than rushing past it to the reassuring practical dimensions of treatment, is part of what a humane response to late diagnosis looks like. Treatment response in late diagnosed adults is generally good, similar or slightly less robust than in children diagnosed in childhood, which may reflect either the greater chronicity of untreated symptoms or the more complex life circumstances that adult treatment must navigate. Adults with late diagnoses often respond well to medication, and for many the experience of the first effective dose is one of the most striking events of their adult lives. A sudden clarity, a quieting of the internal noise, a sense of being able to do things that had previously required enormous effort without the effort. This experience is sometimes described in terms that are difficult to communicate to people who have not had it. It does not feel like being medicated. It feels like being themselves, without the obstacle. The obstacle was always there. They were always working around it. And now, briefly, it is gone, and they can see what their brain looks like when it has what it needs to do, what they were always trying to do. And so, here you are. somewhere between Charles Bradley's accidental discovery in a Rhode Island schoolroom and the 3 a.m. pharmacy refresh on your phone during a shortage that should never have happened, somewhere in all of that, is the story of a brain that was never broken, just wired differently, running a different operating system in a world that was built for a different one, and spending decades being told that the gap between the two was a personal failure rather than an engineering mismatch. Tonight you learned about molecules and mechanisms, about tiny osmotic pumps in tablets, and lysine amino acids attached to amphetamine like sleeping passengers on a train. You learned about a Swiss chemist's wife who liked how a new compound felt before tennis, and about soldiers in North Africa who took stimulants not because they wanted to, but because someone decided it was a logistic solution, and about millions of children in classrooms who were told to try harder for years before someone thought to ask whether trying harder was actually the problem. You learned about the parts of this story that are genuinely good, the medications that work, the diagnoses that arrived and changed someone's life, the slow and imperfect expansion of access to care for people who had been waiting a very long time for someone to take their experience seriously. And you learned about the parts that are still unresolved, the shortage that emptied pharmacy shelves, the women diagnosed at 40 with a lifetime of self-blame quietly dissolving in the light of a new understanding, the questions about fairness and enhancement, and what we owe each other in a world where cognitive capacity is increasingly the currency of survival. None of it is simple. None of it wraps up cleanly. The brain is the most complicated object in the known universe, and the medications designed to support it are working with instruments that are, by the standards of what we still do not understand, remarkably blunt. The dopamine system does not have a user manual. The gap between what works in a clinical trial and what works in a particular life, in a particular body, in a particular year, at a particular dose, that gap is still mostly navigated by trial and error and patience, and the quiet persistence of people who need something to be different and are willing to keep trying until it is. But here is the thing worth carrying with you into sleep tonight. Every person who sat in a classroom and heard they were not trying hard enough and kept showing up anyway, that was resilience. Every adult who built an elaborate system of alarms and sticky notes and calendar reminders and made it work for 20 years before the whole structure finally buckled under the weight of a life that had gotten too complicated for compensating. That was effort. Real, enormous, uncredited effort. The kind that does not show up on a performance review or report card because it was invisible by design. The masking was so good that nobody saw the work underneath it, including, often, the person doing it. And every person who finally sat across from someone and said, quietly or not quietly, with relief or with anger or with both at once, this has a name, this is real, this is something that can be helped, that was courage. The particular courage of saying out loud that you've been struggling in a world that has often responded to that admission with skepticism, with impatience, with the suggestion that maybe you just need to try harder and organize better and want it more. That courage does not get enough credit. It deserves some. So tonight, as you let the thoughts slow down and the room go quiet and the day release its grip on you, maybe think gently of all the brains out there running their particular version of this particular challenge. The child who cannot sit still and does not know why. The woman in her 40s who just got a diagnosis and is sitting with the enormity of it. The adult who called the 12th pharmacy and finally found their medication and took it and felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, like themselves again. The person on the right medication at the right dose who is doing something today that they could not do last year, something ordinary, something that nobody around them would think to notice, and knows what it cost to get there. The brain is stubborn. It is also, in its way, magnificent. And the people who live in the complicated ones, who navigate the noise and the gaps and the starts that do not finish, and the hyper-focus that takes over everything at midnight, they are not broken. They are just working harder than it looks, in the particular way that invisible work always does. Sleep well. The noise can wait until morning.